on the economic syllabus. However, I think it's just really, really important because it sets out what the government was actually trying to do with the economy, and then we can test really whether or not it's actually done that. But what it does suggest from the early days in power, that they had a clear idea of what they wanted to do. So the first thing they wanted to have was the most competitive tax structure in Europe, and this is basically based around the idea of decreasing corporation tax. They also wanted to have the most educated workforce in Europe. They also wanted to shift our economy from consumption and government spending to investment and exports. Clearly the export side hasn't really taken place. And they also wanted the UK to be the best place to set up a business in the whole of Europe. They also really wanted to decrease the public sector. It is actually written on there. They wanted to decrease the public sector and increase the private sector on there. So based also around this idea was the idea that they're going to have monetary activism from an early stage. Well, they've clearly done that now with all their printing of money, low interest rates and low exchange rates, and more recently forward guidance. They also wanted fiscal sustainability. Now that's been much harder to achieve because we still have the largest budget deficit in Europe, but they have brought the budget deficit down, and they want banking reform. At the same time, they've coined this new phrase, expansionary fiscal contraction, which has come all the way from Alberto at Harvard University, and which is all about the idea if you decrease government spending, that will make the public sector smaller, and hopefully that slack will be taken up by the private sector. I'm also very, very keen that you just sort of understand what the IOD said as well, and we can combine the two things together. This is the IOD, it's the Institute of Directors. They wanted to reduce government spending to 35% of GDP, and if you achieve that, then you can have lower taxation of 35% of GDP, and then that creates more enterprise, long run agri-supply curve shifts out, and at the same stage, hopefully that will conform to the Laffer curve. Reducing corporation tax to 15% of GDP from when they wrote it was 22%, right now it's obviously 21%. And they also wanted to continue with their quantitative easing program. The whole basis of the IOD's policy was to increase the underlying trend rate of growth to 3%, rather than currently we think it may have fallen to 1.5% right now. This allows the economy to grow that much more quickly. The basis, the one thing that the government hasn't really achieved is this idea of increasing exports. Because if you are able to increase exports, just like the Chinese did in a massive, massive way, from then they're able to get a trade surplus, very, very high economic growth. We're not talking increasing exports to that sort of scale, obviously, but we still have a trade deficit which is pretty large. So that's the one area in which the government really needs to improve upon. But if you have all of those things, if you do have the most educated workforce in Europe, if you do have the most competitive tax structure in Europe, if it is easy to set up a business, then you're going to have a successful economy. Now, it's easy to say those things, it's much, much harder to achieve those things. But overall, we'd have to say that they've done pretty well so far on those four objectives, and the biggest surprise of the lot against most economists was this idea of expansionary fiscal contraction, which you decrease the public sector, and from there you can also grow the private sector. So most essays, what I'm trying to really say here is try and remember the budget for growth, try and remember the IOD. This occurred in 2011. And also expansionary fiscal contraction, which came out of Harvard University. Right, I just want to read this little piece on here. This was the Director General Simon Walker who said, this is from the IOD, when you strip down future prospects for the British economy, two problems are laid bare. Long-term growth is too slow and the government is too big. Expansionary fiscal contraction. Long-term growth. Hence they want to increase the underlying trend rate of growth. We need to tackle both issues, and that means targeting them explicitly and charging the Office of Budget Responsibility with the job of saying whether or not government policy is making the long-term economic outlook better or worse. We need a supply side revolution with less tax, less public spending, fewer regulations and less employment law. The time for tinkering on the supply side is over. So for them it's all about supply side economics, and I suggest for the government it's all about supply side economics as well. And then we have this surprising policy of where expansionary fiscal contraction appears to be working. So right now the UK is in fact achieving an economic growth rate of 3% compared to the rest of Europe, which is very close to 0%.